Larry, I'll leave that decision up to you. If you don't leave me
guys,
with
we are, hang on.
If you come in the second session.
We are live right now. We've got the indictment of Dr. Anthony Fauci here in the Citizens Grand Jury. Larry, how are you today?
Doing well. This is a very solemn moment. We, of course, have presented in at least 3 grand jury sessions, prior sessions, information and evidence concerning the criminality.
Oh, Larry, I'm sorry. Please, I just accidentally muted your microphone there. Can you hit unmute? Larry, I've muted you by accident. You've got to unmute.
Okay. Let's start over again, guys.
I'd just like to ask all the jurors to be on mute until you are instructed otherwise. Please proceed, Larry.
Okay. We make it more dramatic, Jason. Okay. This is a dramatic moment because we are presenting today an indictment of Dr. Anthony Fauci. We've had several grand jury sessions. This is the 15th session all in all, but we've had 3, I think perhaps even 4 concerning Dr. Fauci. We've had a number of witnesses who have appeared. Dr. Judy Mikovits, Kent Heckenlively, her partner, Judy Mikovits, who worked with Dr. Fauci, John Cullen, others. Information, evidence that's been presented showing that Fauci collaborated with the communist Chinese, sent the seeds of COVID-19 over to them, arranged for a grant, $3.7 million grant to further gain-of-function research. We presented testimony from Senator Rand Paul, who confronted him on that as well. And this gave rise to the Chinese. It was reasonably foreseeable, and it was certainly grossly negligent and reckless that they would turn it into a bioweapon. And even if not a bioweapon, that it would be released, because the research that was being done in Wuhan would have been illegal in our Fort Detrick lab, the military lab in Maryland. In addition to that, he's withheld material information to the American people about the short, medium, and long-term effects of these vaccines. He stands to profit from the marketing of these vaccines, which are making trillions of dollars for Big Pharma, for Pfizer, for Moderna, for Johnson & Johnson. The government, if you want to call it that, has pushed these vaccines knowing that in many ways they're dangerous. They're inadequate testing, if no testing at all. Moderna admitted that with regard to pregnant women. Certain groups, blacks and Hispanics, because of the DNA makeup of these groups and other factors, it can be very dangerous for them. Those who already have had COVID-19, it can trigger a dangerous reaction, which can be deadly. That's not in dispute. Now we know the vaccines don't even work. I mean, let's use just one example. The #1 golfer in the world, Jon Rahm, who at the Memorial Tournament, right before he was to play the 4th round, the final round, and he was 8 shots ahead, took a test. Turned out he had COVID-19, was disqualified. He hadn't taken the second shot. Well, he then took the second shot, went on to win the US Open, and now wanted to play in Tokyo, Japan in the Olympics. So the Japanese made him take another test, and he has COVID-19 again. So they're being told that we should take risks with our bodies and our lives. It's being pushed on children, pushed on pregnant women, pushed on adolescents, pushed on the elderly, when in fact, the vaccine is not as effective as they claim it is. And then we don't know the long-term risks because it's never been finally approved by the FDA. And even if it was, the FDA is in the hip pocket of pharma, big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies. It's a revolving door. I know because I used to represent the FDA at the U.S. Department of Justice when I was a young lawyer in the antitrust division. So we are presenting our indictment today. It's a 17-page work. We're presenting it to the grand jury in draft form. If you find anything in there that you want to change, if you don't feel that we've justified any aspect of that, we, the prosecution, the citizens grand jury prosecutor, you can make changes. We're going to give it to you in Word. I want you to elect a foreman or a forewoman, whatever you want to call that person. Of course, in today's world, who knows whether they're male or female? I'm being facetious, but not really. It's up to you to elect someone who can sign this indictment once you deliberate. This will be up as everything else we do. It's transparent. It's up on our website at freedomwatchusa.org. So you may review it, but we're also going to give you a hard copy. And then you deliberate and you'll report back next week as to whether or not your foreperson will sign this grand jury indictment for you. And once that happens, we'll proceed to a trial. And we'll give Dr. Fauci notice of the crimes he's been accused of. Again, it's just probable cause, which Justice Scalia said can occur even on mere suspicion at a grand jury proceeding. He'll have an opportunity to defend himself, as Robert Mueller will. We've already indicted him, and as is Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, and James Biden will also, because they've been indicted as well. But let's talk about Fauci now. And he'll have notice. He can come to a trial, wage a defense. We're going to have a judge. We'll have a jury that can be selected. We will try him. We will seek his indictment. He frankly warrants indictment and sentencing, conviction and sentencing, in my opinion, for life, with the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that have died because of his conduct, his criminal conduct. And it's time that we, the American people, started to hold these people accountable, because we know that our so-called government won't. They're part of one big club. They protect each other, Democrat or Republican, making money hand over fist at the expense of the American people. Well, the American people, now it's time to rise up as our founding fathers rose up in 1776 when they took their legal system back from King George, when he had stolen it and taken it to London, England. And we need to enforce the law under the laws of nature, and nature's God. And for that reason, you know, in this indictment, as you'll see, Mr. Goodman is going to read it to you in just a few minutes. We have a section that'll deal with lying to the American people, because under man-made law, not the laws of nature and nature's God, which are supposed to track the Ten Commandments, that's our Judeo-Christian heritage, that's supposed to be the basis of our legal system, is that when an American citizen lies to the government under 18 U.S.C. 1001, he will get 10 years for each material lie or omission of fact. The same should be true for when government officials lie to the American people. But of course, no law exists for that, because they're not going to hold themselves accountable. So consequently, under the laws of nature and nature's God, under our 10 commandments, they're going to be held accountable. And that's part of the indictment. We're not bound by the laws that were created by these politicians in Washington, D.C. We are bound by the laws of nature and nature's God, and what is just and what is fair and what is ethical. That being said, I turn it over to Mr. Goodman, Jason, to read this indictment to the citizens grand jury. It'll be presented to you in draft form. You'll deliberate, like I said. Next week we'll reconvene, and I will ask your foreperson to sign whatever you have agreed is the true bill of indictment against Dr. Anthony Fauci. Mr. Goodman, Jason, take it away. Read the indictment.
Thank you, Larry. Before the citizens grand jury, this is an indictment brought by the people of the United States of America against Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci. Criminal indictment. The citizens grand jury charges that, one, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci began working...
Read the subheadings too, Jason. General allegation.
Sorry. These are the general allegations, of course. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci began working at the National Institute of Health. Hereinafter, we'll refer to it as the NIH. It's a subunit that he's working at, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. He started working there in 1968. The NIH is a separate and independent agency from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Despite public misperception of his role, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has never worked at the CDC, nor has he ever led the NIH, but has influenced public health agencies and officials far beyond his official role and authority at the sub-agency NIAID. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci graduated from New York City's Cornell Medical College in 1966 and then conducted his internship and residency. That is, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has almost always worked as a government bureaucrat, not really as a practicing physician, beginning his internship and residency as a required continuation of his medical degree in 1966, but then beginning his government career in 1968. From 1970 to 1971, Dr. Anthony Fauci was briefly the chief resident at the New York Hospital at the Cornell Medical Center. Nevertheless, his career is overwhelmingly in government, not private medical practice. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci was appointed as the director of NIAID in 1984. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has continued as the director of NIAID from 1984 up through the present and continuing. In 1984, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci's primary initiative, beyond the regular administrative tasks of running NIAID, was to develop a vaccine for inoculating people against the AIDS disease caused by the HIV virus. The AIDS disease was then spreading rapidly and alarmingly as an epidemic. According to some virologists, like Dr. Judy Mikovits, who has worked with Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institute of Health, one reason that the AIDS disease was then spreading rapidly and alarmingly as an epidemic was that the public health establishment and government, including Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, and medical practice were pursuing the wrong strategies which were ineffective, thus allowing AIDS to proliferate. That is, a disease that is being addressed ineffectively will appear to be extremely threatening and difficult to stop, but if addressed with measures that actually work, may well quickly shrink. Whether a disease seems very dangerous or not may be a result of whether the best prevention, treatment, and therapy is being applied. The public health establishment in government, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, and medical practice were overly fixated, for their own personal reasons, on developing an expensive vaccine for the AIDS disease caused by the HIV virus instead of using effective treatments. The public health establishment, including Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, were overly fixated for their own personal reasons on expensive solutions like new patentable vaccines for AIDS over effectiveness of limiting the disease. Today, AIDS has dramatically receded as a threat to public health because attention and effort shifted towards medicines and treatments that actually work and away from medicines and treatments that are expensive and profitable to manufacturers. Because of his resistance to more effective methods, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci's delay in treating AIDS patients and those most at risk of AIDS effectively led to more deaths than necessary. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci became publicly known as a medical leader fighting AIDS, although, in fact, he met with little success in making progress against AIDS. However, he never achieved the goal of developing an AIDS or HIV vaccine. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci resisted and ridiculed the research and revelations of others, such as Dr. Judy Mikovits, that many viruses like HIV did not directly cause the AIDS disease, but a sometimes unregulated immune response created the AIDS disease response. The AIDS disease response. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has been accused of eventually stealing the discoveries of others and their revelations of the difference between a dangerous virus from the disease that results from it, and eventually promoted other people's work as his own. In subsequent years, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, as director of the NIAID, successively tackled in similar fashion other world epidemics or pandemics, such as the original SARS, West Nile virus, swine flu virus, Ebola, and the like.
Actually, there's a typo there. I shouldn't say successfully attempted to tackle. That is
successively. He was unsuccessful, but in succession, he did attempt to address these things.
Right.
With each epidemic, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci favored the same approaches of pursuing high-cost vaccines and medications favored by major pharmaceutical companies and de-emphasizing more effective but less profitable medications and treatments. Throughout his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has publicly and privately undermined and attacked or plagiarized the work of other researchers pursuing different strategies from his own, intended for his own personal, financial, and other gain. With each epidemic, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci also refused to consider, rejected, and argued against research by virologists that viral epidemics might not stand alone, but experience cumulative or interactive effects such that a prior viral infection or vaccination may leave pathways in cellular lining or residues from vaccination or infection. Throughout his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has rejected and undermined investigation into the possible interactions within humans between different viral diseases. Throughout his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has rejected and undermined research into why some patients experience very light symptoms and very little effect from a virus, where a few of the infected persons suffer catastrophic or at very least serious disease reactions. What accounts for the radically divergent disease response from the same virus in different people? Throughout his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has rejected and undermined research into the possibility that patients who have had an infection in the past from one viral disease may react to a new viral disease quite differently because of the combination in their system of the two different viruses or residues in their system than someone who has only been exposed to just one of the viruses alone. Throughout his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has rejected and undermined findings claiming that the process for growing vaccines for their mass production contains unsafe residue in their cell lines and mediums for growing more vaccines, thus risking harm to those being vaccinated not from the vaccine, but from the medium in which the vaccine has grown and the cell lines used to grow the vaccines. Through decades of dishonest politicking, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has wielded persuasive and undue influence in the public health communities in the United States and worldwide, beyond his ability to formally direct or order any action or inaction, as reported by Dr. Judy Mikovits and other direct witnesses who personally witnessed it. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci attempted to demand that Dr. Mikovits' boss and office comply with his commands, even though he was not in their chain of command and they did not work for him. As reported by Dr. Judy Mikovits and other direct witnesses who personally witnessed it, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci was able to persuade a scientific journal to cancel publication of a peer-reviewed article of research performed by Dr. Mikovits' boss. As reported by Dr. Judy Mikovits and other direct witnesses who personally witnessed it, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci then arranged the reverse engineering of the canceled article, had his friend reconstruct the research, and then had the same content published separately under his friend's name. Thus, the evidence showing that Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, in fact, is able to lobby, manipulate, and influence public health officials worldwide who do not actually work for him and who do not report to him in government agencies and private medical organizations in the United States and around the world. This conduct, as well as other conduct set forth in this indictment, in every count, was intended to promote and further Dr. Anthony Fauci's personal interests for his financial and other gain, and what, on information and belief, appears to be obsessive megalomania in general. In October 2012, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci published a paper in the American Society of Microbiology, in which he argued in support of gain-of-function research. Gain-of-function research involves laboratory experiments genetically manipulating viruses to make the virus more infectious and/or deadly, including to humans. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, through the agency he runs, NIAID, funded gain-of-function research on coronaviruses to make them more deadly and more easily spread among humans. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci promoted and furthered a $3.7 million grant from NIAID during the Obama-Biden administration to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the Communist People's Republic of China, hereinafter Communist China. Through an intermediary organization with the knowledge of Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, that the money was being sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Reportedly, there may have been a second $3.7 million grant from NIAID to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. As a result, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci funded the creation of the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, with U.S. taxpayer funds through NIAID. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci funded through NIAID through an intermediary EcoHealth Alliance run in part by Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak has admitted in published research journal papers that gain-of-function research in Wuhan, Communist China, was funded by the NIAID. Researchers involved in the gain-of-function research gave a panel discussion, speech recorded on C-SPAN around 2017. EHA's work with the WIV studying bat-based coronaviruses was funded with a $3.4 million NIH grant, according to the Wall Street Journal. As the Weekend Australian quoted, despite the risks involved, Fauci called gain-of-function experiments important work in his 2012 writing. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci stated in the 2012 published paper, "In an unlikely but conceivable turn of events, what if that scientist becomes infected with the virus, which leads to an outbreak and ultimately triggers a pandemic? Many ask reasonable questions. Given the possibility of such a scenario, however remote, should the initial experiments have been performed and/or published in the first place? And what were the processes involved in that decision? Scientists working in this field might say, as indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments are the resulting knowledge outweighs the risks. It is more likely that a pandemic would occur in nature, and the need to stay ahead of such a threat is a primary reason for performing an experiment that might appear to be risky. Within the research community, many have expressed concern that important research progress could come to a halt just because of the fear that someone, somewhere, might attempt to replicate these experiments sloppily. This is a valid concern." As further explained by National Review, the Weekend Australian report adds that Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, did not alert senior White House officials before lifting a ban on gain-of-function research in 2017. In 2014, the Obama administration paused funding for gain-of-function experiments in 22 fields, including those involving SARS, influenza, and MERS, because of the increased risk such experimentation carries of causing a pandemic. Yet the EcoHealth Alliance diverted $600,000 in grants to the NIH, to the WIV.
From the NIH.
Sorry, they diverted $600,000 in grants from the NIH to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the form of subgrants from 2014 through 2019 for the purpose of studying bat coronaviruses. As shown in emails and documents publicly released, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci knew that the funds were being transferred to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Furthermore, samples of viruses and cell lines used to cultivate viruses were sent from Fort Detrick's viral laboratory to the Wuhan Institute of Virology at the request of Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci. The raw material of COVID-19, the raw materials were actually provided to China by Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci at his behest, an intervention in Communist China's favor. U.S. diplomats wrote 2 cables to Washington, D.C. in 2018 warning of safety issues at the WIV. The cables specifically noted that researchers at the lab had discovered new bat-based coronaviruses that could easily infect humans, Politico reported. Their warnings went ignored. Furthermore, on January 15th, in its last days, President Donald Trump's State Department put out a statement with serious claims about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The statement said that U.S. intelligence community had evidence that several researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology laboratory were sick with coronavirus-like symptoms in autumn of 2019, implying the Chinese government had hidden crucial information about the outbreak for months, and that the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab, despite presenting itself as a civilian institution, was conducting secret research projects with the Chinese military. The State Department alleged a Chinese government cover-up and asserted that Beijing continues today to withhold vital information that scientists need to protect the world from this deadly virus and the next one. Experts have raised the possibility that the COVID-19 pandemic could have originated from a potential lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, Communist China, where gain-of-function experiments on bat coronaviruses have been conducted. No animal in Wuhan or surrounding Hubei province has been found infected with the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2. The type of bat that apologists for Communist China claim have carried the COVID viruses actually
may have carried.
Sorry, these are apologists who claim that it may have carried the COVID virus. They actually live 900 to 1,200 miles away from Wuhan. There are no reports that the type of bat that apologists for Communist China claim have carried the COVID virus was ever sold at the Wuhan seafood market. That type of bat was, however, being experimented on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The earliest reported cases of COVID-19 had no connection to the Wuhan seafood market or wet market, where the apologists for Communist China claim someone bought and ate a bat carrying the virus. The Wuhan Institute of Virology, where Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci funded gain-of-function research to create more deadly and more infectious versions of the coronaviruses, is located exactly where the outbreak of COVID-19 began. It has now been revealed that as early as October 2019, 3 staff members at the Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick with an unexplained illness that matches the symptoms and characteristics of COVID-19. However, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci advocated for Communist China as an agent within the meaning of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci used his influence and lobbying with the news media and government to promote false and dangerous narratives hiding Communist China's role and guilt, including in promoting the knowingly and clearly false narrative that COVID-19 came from a bat sold at the Wuhan seafood market or some other animal source of transmission, rather than from Communist China's laboratory. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci acted with an official Washington acted within official Washington to promote China's interests with false and deceptive information. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci conspired with the World Health Organization to deceive the world's government officials and the American people. However, when asked about NIAID's funding of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci reportedly lied to other government agencies. Repeatedly lied, sorry.
Yeah.
To other government agencies and government officials. He lied to Congress in official hearings, and he lied to the American people. Senator Rand Paul, among others, directly asked Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci about funding the genetic manipulation of coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Senator Rand Paul has given Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci multiple opportunities to retract his false sworn testimony, asking him again and again to show that Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci, his lies are knowing and willful. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci at first lied in congressional hearings by denying that NIAID funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. More recently, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci has admitted that NIAID funded research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but denied that the genetic manipulation of coronaviruses, including the original SARS virus, qualified as gain-of-function research. Senator Rand Paul read to Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci in the congressional hearing the NIH's definition of gain-of-function research and read the details of the NIAID grant to Echo Health and the description in journal articles by Peter Daszak. Yet, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci still denied that what NIAID funded at the Wuhan Institute of Virology qualified as gain-of-function research. MIT biologist Kevin Esvelt reviewed that paper that was published with the financial assistance from Dr. Fauci's NIH NIAID and concluded certain techniques that the research used seemed to meet the definition of gain-of-function. At the present time, in his career, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci is the highest paid official in the U.S. government, earning more than the President of the United States. After the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and the circumstantial evidence, after the start of the pandemic, the circumstantial evidence shows that Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci used his influence to organize and arrange the sabotage of the life-saving COVID-19 treatments hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci offered transparently false and inconsistent arguments, pushing on the one hand unproven speculation about some topics surrounding COVID-19, but then arguing that hydroxychloroquine had not been through years of rigorous testing for use to fight COVID-19, although it had been approved for fighting malaria in 1953, given that COVID-19 had only existed at that point for about 7 to 8 months in total. His proclamations lacked any or more than the slimmest of evidence, but Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci sabotaged life-saving treatment by asserting a completely different standard of research than he did not apply to his favored recommendations. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci's worldwide sabotage campaign against hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine resulted in the deaths of a very large number of the 4 million people who died of COVID-19, who could have been saved from COVID-19 by early intervention with hydroxychloroquine. Furthermore, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci knowingly and willfully lied about the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine and induced others to disparage the well-established medication approved since 1953 in order to support the emergency use authorization of expensive new vaccines, in order to maximize the profits for friends and allies and himself. On information and belief, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci engaged in kickbacks and other illegal acts in and by the big pharmaceutical companies in order to further this scheme Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci needed to sabotage any effective treatment for COVID-19 in order to meet the legal test for emergency use authorization. Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are equivalents, but hydroxychloroquine was developed to have fewer side effects and to be safer for widespread use. A change in the law enabled government employees like Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci to own or share financial benefit in patents and or the NIAID, which he controls, to be part owner in the patents. He's listed as one of the co-inventors of many relevant and related patents. We're going to review the counts now. Count 1, lying to government officials, 18 U.S. Code Section 1001. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. This count is brought against Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci for making multiple false statements to other agencies, officers, and branches of the U.S. government. Lying to officials of the U.S. government is criminalized only in part to the extent that the false information interferes with the operations of U.S. government agencies. Therefore, even though Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci is a government official, knowingly and willfully deceiving other government officials, agents, or agencies can harm the operations of the government just as much. Conviction for the felony crime of 18 U.S. Code Section 1001A applies if an accused in any manner within the jurisdiction of the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the government of the United States knowingly and willfully A, falsifies, conceals, or covers up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact, or B, makes a false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representations, or C, makes or uses any false writing or document knowing the same to contain any false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or entry, and the information is material in the topic being investigated or considered. In this context, in any manner within the jurisdiction of the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the government of the United States means any official proceeding, investigation, decision-making, adjudication, hearing, etc., etc. Matter here means an activity of the U.S. government. In this context, material means that the information or lack of information is relevant and capable of changing a government decision or conclusion. So information, or the withholding of information, would be material if the government proceeding, decision, action, or the like might turn out differently had the truthful information been fully presented to the government agency or official. It is not required that the decision or conclusion is certain to be different, but whether the government decision makers were entitled to the information to be able to make the best decision or come to the best conclusion that they might have.
There's a typo there. Of should be or, as you read, Jason. Good. Okay.
Section 1001 has a long and distinguished history and has been used against notable convicted liars, Rod Blagojevich, Scooter Libby, Bernard Madoff, Martha Stewart, and Jeffrey Skilling, and Roger Stone of late. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci knowingly and willfully lied to government officials and agencies to protect China and to hide his own involvement in creating the COVID-19 virus. Count 2, lying to Congress, 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. Conviction for the felony crime of 18 U.S. Code Section 1001A applies also to testimony before a congressional hearing or any other information provided to Congress or withheld from Congress so as to create a false impression, including in any manner within the jurisdiction of the executive, legislative, or judicial branch of the government of the United States. 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 further explains, C. With respect to any matter within the jurisdiction of the legislative branch, subsection A shall apply only to 1. Administrative matters including a claim for payment, a matter related to the procurement of property or services, personal or employment practices, or support services, or a document required by law, rule, or regulation to be submitted to the Congress or any office or officer within the legislative branch. Or 2, any investigation or review conducted pursuant to the authority of any committee, subcommittee, commission, or office of the Congress consistent with applicable rules of the House or Senate. Dr. Anthony Fauci knowingly and willingly lied to Congress to protect China and to hide his own involvement in creating the COVID-19 virus. Count 3, lying to the American people. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. Asserting the common law and the laws of nature and of nature's God, if the people are prosecuted for lying to the government, then the government should be prosecuted for lying to the people. As set forth above, Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci knowingly and willfully lied to the American people to protect Communist China and to hide his own involvement in creating the COVID-19 virus and to maximize the profits of big pharmaceutical companies. Count 4, criminally negligent homicide, covered within the broad reach of 18 U.S.C. 51. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and realleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. The crime of criminally negligent homicide involves causing someone's death by acting in a manner that was reckless, inattentive, or careless. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci funded the creation of COVID-19 by funding the genetic manipulation of SARS-CoV-1, and other coronaviruses. As Dr. Stephen Anthony Fauci knew that the genetic manipulation of dangerous viruses posed a severe threat to the world's population, because he explicitly said so in his 2012 article and knowingly argued to intentionally disregard that severe risk. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci facilitated the creation of COVID-19 by arranging for some of the ingredients for the genetic manipulation to be provided to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci caused the death of at least thousands of Americans by sabotaging effective medical treatments proven safe since 1953, like hydroxychloroquine, and delaying the treatment of infected persons to favor creating expensive vaccines profitable to allies in the big pharmaceutical industries. In order for someone to be convicted of negligent homicide, the prosecution must prove A, that the defendant knew that their behavior included unjustifiable risk and that this caused another person to die. For instance, should someone be accidentally shot after playing with a gun and a second person does not phone medical help, that person could be charged with negligent homicide, as this is an unjustifiable risk since everyone is expected to know a shot wound can lead to death. B, that an act of omission took place. In some cases, causation doesn't have to be demonstrated.
In some states.
In some states. Causation doesn't have to be demonstrated, and omission is enough for a charge. Using the example above of the gunshot wound, the state would have to prove that the defendant would have lived if the other did phone for medical help. C, that there is causation. Often, causation has to be demonstrated through an affirmative act. For instance, if someone drives over the speed limit in a school zone when children are exiting the school and hits and kills a child, there is clear cause and effect relationship. Negligent homicide, in other words, happens when someone causes the death of another through criminal negligence. Criminal negligence happens when someone behaves in a way that he or she should have known is risky. It is a much lower intent, but still a serious crime. For purposes of this indictment, the threshold of probable cause has been met. Count 5. Foreign Agents Registration Act. 22 U.S. Code, Section 612. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and re-alleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. 22 U.S. Code Section 612 requires that A. Filing. Contents. No person shall act as an agent of a foreign principal unless he has filed with the Attorney General a true and complete registration statement and supplements thereto as required by Sections A and B of this section, or unless he is exempt from registration under the provisions of this subchapter. Except as hereinafter provided, every person who becomes an agent of a foreign principal shall within 10 days thereafter file with the Attorney General, in duplicate, a registration statement under oath on a form prescribed by the Attorney General. The obligation of an agent of a foreign principal to file a registration statement shall, after the 10th day of his becoming such agent, continue from day to day, and termination of such status shall not relieve such agent from his obligation to file a registration statement for the period during which he was an agent of foreign principal. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci represented the interests of Communist China to influence U.S. government actions and foreign policy. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci did not register as a foreign agent as required by FARA within the relevant time periods, but illegally acted as a foreign agent representing the interests of foreign countries to influence the actions and omissions of actions.
Or omissions
of actions to benefit foreign countries and wealthy businesses and oligarchs politically connected in those foreign countries. Count 6, obstruction of justice, 18 U.S. Code Section 1501 through 1520. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and re-alleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci actively interfered with attempts of the U.S. government to determine whether or not to hold Communist China accountable for its actions through misdirection, interference, lobbying on China's behalf, and false statements. The U.S. government lost months of effective actions by Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci's interference. Count 7, honest services fraud, 18 U.S.C. 1346. The previous allegations of the entirety of this indictment are repeated and re-alleged as incorporated herein with the same force and effect as if fully set forth herein. Honest services fraud is defined in Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1346 as a scheme to defraud another of the intangible right to honest services through a scheme to violate a fiduciary duty by bribery or kickbacks. A fiduciary duty is a duty to act only for the financial benefit of the public
only for
and
only for the benefit of the public.
I believe, sorry if I didn't say that, only for the benefit of the public, an employer, shareholders, or a union.
Okay.
Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci Jr. had a fiduciary duty to the public as a public official and to the United States of America to perform duties and obligations on behalf of the United States for the benefit of the United States of America. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci Jr. knowingly devised and also participated in a scheme to defraud, and that is intended to deceive or cheat the public and to deprive the public of the intangible right to honest services on information and belief through bribery or kickbacks, including by conspiring with Communist China and the World Health Organization. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci Jr. acted with the intent to defraud. Dr. Anthony Stephen Fauci Jr.'s scheme to defraud involved a materially false or fraudulent pretense, representation, or promise, including omission and concealment of material information capable of influencing the decision of others. The public in the United States of America were severely and irreparably harmed by this scheme. This is a true bill to be signed by the foreperson and Prosecutor Larry Klayman.
Thank you, Jason. I know that's very difficult to read 20 pages. You did a great job. So this is being presented to the Citizens Grand Jury to deliberate in the next week. We will come back. We'll take your deliberations during that week. If necessary, I will make any changes that are required, but this is what I am presenting to you. And it's very important that we get this indictment and then proceed with a trial of Dr. Anthony Fauci, where he will be provided his due process and other constitutional rights to defend himself. And if we obtain a conviction, as I said, we will then move to sentencing by the court and also carrying out that sentence peacefully and legally. You can see from this indictment that Dr. Anthony Fauci committed a number of crimes. And one of those crimes was negligent homicide. And ask yourself this question. The police officer in Minnesota, Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of negligent homicide, killed one person. Fauci is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people worldwide. And we know that other countries listening to what he has to say as well, because they have expertise. Consequently, we have to return this true bill of indictment, and we will proceed, as we said we would proceed, on behalf of the American people. You are aware that the Justice Department, my once proud alma mater, particularly now under the control of so-called President Biden and so-called President Harris, will not prosecute these crimes. And in fact, the Justice Department, even under President Trump, with the Attorney General Jeffrey Sessions and Bill Barr, would not have prosecuted these crimes either. Most recently, with regard to the Justice Department, which is being used in effect as its own Gestapo to round up American people who have seen the lying and deceit by our so-called government, who rose up by and large peacefully on January 6th. Over 700 have been arrested. Many have been charged, over 500, I believe it is. I have some clients who have not been charged, but they have been had their constitutional rights violated by our once Department of Justice, which has become the Department of Injustice. And most recently, as just another example of the compromised corruption in the Biden-Harris Justice Department, they sent out a warning just yesterday that states could not themselves conduct election audits to see whether or not the election was fraudulent, that the states would be held accountable for altering ballots before this Justice Department even knows that ballots were altered. It tells you the motivation of the Biden-Harris Justice Department. And then with regard to Senator Mo Brooks from Alabama, who made certain statements with regard to January 6th and otherwise, and was sued by Representative Eric Swalwell, a ultra-leftist Democrat who had a sexual relationship apparently with a Chinese spy who still remains in the U.S. House of Representatives. Swalwell sued Mo Brooks. The Biden-Harris Justice Department is refusing to provide a defense for Mo Brooks when the Westfall Act has been invoked to allow for that. This is in contrast to when Hillary Clinton was sued, and I know because I sued her on behalf of my clients, Charles Woods and Patricia Smith, when their sons were killed in Benghazi as a result of Hillary Clinton's negligence and wrongful death actions, negligent homicide, by using a unsecure private email server, which led to the coordinates of the Ambassador Christopher Stevens and then the death of my client's sons. The government stepped in, the Justice Department stepped in and defended Hillary Clinton at no cost to her. So this is what you're dealing with this Justice Department in particular, run and the hack Attorney General Merrick Garland and the hack FBI Christopher Wray, who are more concerned with people who peacefully rose up to protest the election results and the rank corruption of government on January 6th. And I'm not talking about those who were violent, I'm talking about those that were peaceful. As an aside, I brought a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, to redress that against the FBI director of the FBI and those agents that have been involved in the violation of constitutional rights. And you can see that at freedomwatchusa.org. But the big point is this, ladies and gentlemen, of the Citizens Grand Jury and the American people who are watching, is that we must enforce the laws ourselves, because what we have now is a corrupt Justice Department that will not do it on our own as our founding in the years leading up revolution and in creating the greatest nation on earth. We must restore that by restoring the rule of law with honest judges and the citizenry who must restore the vision of our founding fathers and must restore this nation. It has already been rendered by leftists who seized control. So we will be in further contact with you, and we will seek that indictment to be signed next same place. Tune in also to our Third Continental Congress, which begins at 11 a.m. Pacific, because these are the kinds of things that cause us to consider whether to declare independence and it no longer represents us. We will be back next week, continuation and seeking the indictment, which will be signed at that by the foreperson of the Citizens Grand Jury. Thank you for listening to me. This is a very solemn exercise, something which needs to be. No one in the history of the country is responsible for the death of more people. Dr. Anthony Fauci. I leave it at that.
And Larry, before we go, I want to remind our viewers that they can support Larry and his team at Freedom Watch by going to freedomwatchusa.org. It's important to contribute. Your financial contribution is tax deductible, and it helps Larry continue the work that the Department of Justice will not do. These Citizens Grand Juries and the Continental Congress take a lot of time and resources, so we can't do these things without your help. I also want to remind people that if they are having difficulty on Facebook or YouTube, there are many ways to watch the show. People can subscribe to the Freedom Watch YouTube channel, watch our simulcasts of Citizens Grand Juries, as well as Larry's podcasts and other content on there. There does seem to be some sort of internet disruption in general today that seems to be affecting YouTube, Facebook, Larry's connection to me, and a couple of other things. People can also now watch Crowdsource the Truth live streams on Odyssey.com/@Crowdsource the Truth. Today's Citizens Grand Jury has been simulcast on Odyssey.com. You can also watch on Rumble.com. Don't miss the Third Continental Congress if you haven't seen it. It's available on many platforms, including Rumble.com. Search for CS The Truth. And remember, you can support this channel by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I can't bring you incredible guests like Larry Klayman and important events like the Citizens Grand Jury without your support and sponsorship. So please visit Subscribestar or Patreon. We'll see you later today with deliberations for the Third Continental Congress. That'll be happening at 11 a.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on all of the platforms I've just mentioned. We look forward to seeing everybody there, and thanks for watching. Thank
you, Jason. Excellent job. And I urge people to support Jason's work because he allows the truth to be told. That's why the name is crowdsourcethetruth.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.